Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week, we have Gradius II, Gopher no Yabo, the 1988 sequel to the storied franchise. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Konami, Gradius II would release to Japanese arcades in 1988. It would see a release outside of Japan under a different title, Vulcan Venture. It received some ports for the Famicom as well as the PC Engine CD, and would be included on some Gradius compilations for such systems as the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation, and the PSP. It would also see several digital re-releases over the years, including on the Wii Virtual Console, and most recently as an arcade archive title a few years back on the PlayStation 4, and the version that we're looking at today, the Nintendo Switch version. So here we find ourselves at the main menu of the arcade archive release itself. So before we go any further, just let me say that I'm not the biggest fan of this one, and if you're looking to play Gradius II, I would say seek a different version, as I'm not going to recommend the arcade version. And I'll get to why a little bit later. So before we get to all that though, let's talk about the release itself. As is typical for a hamster release, we do have multiple versions on the arcade archive. There's the original Japanese, Gradius II, as well as the international release Vulcan Venture, which is the one we'll be playing today. There's also the usual high score mode, where you set a highest score as possible in one continue, and the caravan mode, where you do the same in 5 minutes. Starting the game, we're taken to our title screen, and as this is an arcade emulator, we'll put some coins into the machine and start. Then we're taken to this power meter selection. So if you're a fan of the Gradius franchise, you'll know what's going on here. But if you're not, basically this is our loadout selection. And the key things to note here are the missile, the double, and the laser. Each loadout has a different missile type. The double changes back and forth between the double and the tail gun, and the laser changes between the laser and the ripple. Then we select our shield. There are two types, shield and force field. I'm curious, what's your preferred shield type? If you have an opinion, please include it in the description below. I'm curious to hear what everybody's favorite types of shields are. Mine is, of course, the force field, which envelops the ship. Although it can't take as many hits as the forward defending shield, I just feel that it's better to cover yourself from all directions. So, as is typical for a Gradius title, we're dropped into space fighting these enemies, which will drop these power capsules. Collect the power capsules, and we're able to upgrade our ship via the upgrade bar at the bottom of the screen. One capsule equals one movement on that bar, and then we can select our particular power-up. So right off the bat, I've selected options to help give ourselves, and some rather multiple, to give ourselves some additional firepower. You can kind of select how you want to power up your ship based off of your personal playstyle, although I would not recommend the double in this game, as although there are situations where specifically the tail gun could be useful, it's just too slow to be very effective. So far we've picked up a couple of multiples, we now have missiles, and of course one thing you always want is your speed up, as the base speed of the Vic Viper, our fighter, is way too slow to be effective at dodging any enemy shots. So that's always a priority. Upgrade once, twice, depending on the situation. And there might be one or two situations where you might want to go beyond that, but those are pretty rare. So from here we're going to aim for our shield, and then maybe a laser. So as far as the multiples are concerned, it's possible to equip up to 4 multiples. That's important to note, as that will provide you the greatest firepower, and that can come into play quite a bit much later on. So one thing I do want to talk about this release, one thing that I think is really awesome, depending on which loadout you pick, especially if you do take the force field, your color of force field will be different. So this particular loadout I really like because your force field color is green, and I just love the color green. Other colors are blue, orange, red, depending on your loadout. Here we find ourselves at our first boss, and the game has some nice sound clips telling us to shoot the head. Just a little bit of digitized voice, which really is neat, and something that Konami arcade games were, well, sound design in general, are really known for. That first stage actually has really awesome music, as well as some really great graphics. We didn't actually talk about it at the time, but those massive suns are very, very impressive given the era. So the game itself is a horizontal scrolling shoot 'em up, but there are most of the stages actually in the game have certain verticality to them. This second stage being no different. The second stage is another real visual stunner. It's got this really alien HR or like HR Geiger design to it. And there are even some points later on in the stage itself where it looks like they're even borrowing some assets from another Konami franchise, Contra. So we've basically covered the main basics of Gradius II. The game itself really is, as far as like a Gradius title, really by the book. In fact, in a lot of ways, it kind of helped establish a lot of the series. Though, like, depending on how you view the series, this isn't actually the second title in the series. The second title would be Salamander, but that's considered an offshoot. So it's a little bit weird that way. We do have the graspy hands making a return from Salamander. Those graspy hands do get a little embarrassed when you shoot them, and they just tend to like shrink into themselves. So here we're going to see a little bit of like that alien guy or Contra-esque inspiration. So we've got these little pods which release alien facehugger-like creatures. You want to stay on top of those aliens, as one important part of this game, and really any shoot 'em up, is controlling the number of enemies on screen. So we're nearly at the end of the second stage, and here's where things can start to get frustrating. Although there's some neat little elements to this fight as well. The boss does tell us to shoot the eye, kind of an obvious given. But those hands are throwing out these balls, and one neat little feature is, if you'll notice, the ones I don't destroy are attaching to the back of the screen, making rather cramped space even more cramped as the fight continues. Just a neat little feature. Oh, so one thing I do want to point out, there is kind of a rank system that is present in really most Gradius titles. As you power up, the game itself recognizes that and will make the enemies more difficult. Certain enemies that, as like at a base or low power, that do not fire shots or don't fire as many shots, will power up essentially as you yourself get stronger. Making like the choice to actually fully power up a good question to ask. So here we find ourselves in stage 3, the crystal stage. And like with any bubble or crystal stage that the Gradius franchise has, there is slowdown present in here. There's also some great sound effects. I love the bonk sound effect that the big crystals make of when you split them apart. So, I mentioned that I don't like this particular arcade release. Why is that? Well, it really starts to become apparent in this stage. So, if you aren't fully powered up, or at least have some power-ups, this stage becomes frustratingly difficult. There are sections where there'll be tons of crystals to shoot, and at base power, it's nearly impossible to destroy them in a fashion where you can proceed through the stage without meeting an rather unfortunate and untimely demise. Some neat physics going on there. There's usually a pattern that those follow, but they weren't following that pattern today, so a little bit surprised, but still, it's pretty awesome when you see differences in the game that you're playing. So, it's kind of at this point in the game where if you have not, or rather if you die, it's almost worth it just to reset and start from the very beginning, as this section that we're coming up on is very, very difficult to get through without having additional firepower. If you're actually try to shoot these crystals, you'll be able to get them to split, but then you're just making things more difficult on yourself, as the screen is full of tons and tons of crystals. Whereas if you don't shoot at all, then there's just too many of them to dodge around and you ultimately die. And this is one spot where it's really, really easy to get stuck on the game. So that brings me to my minus flavors. Biggest minus flavor, the game is too goddamn hard. So this section is just kind of the beginning of that whole super hard element where we just have too much going on to easily get through without dying. And it's because of a twofold problem. The game has an issue with its checkpoints being poorly designed. You could argue that there's almost like many checkpoints, or the checkpoints come in spots where it's very, very difficult to obtain any power-ups. So you're going to be on base power moving through much of the game after you've died, as it's very, very hard to build yourself back up. In addition to that, it suffers greatly from what I've called in the past power down syndrome. And it's mainly the Konami, the Gradius franchise that has led me to calling things with that whole power down syndrome. As I love the Gradius franchise, but man, it's just it's frustrating when you die. So we've got a game over, and this is actually something that's really interesting. When you're entering in your score, there's an age, and one thing that's interesting to note is as you move through the age, the picture for your gender changes. Unfortunately, at the age that I am, the picture there's starting to lose hair and looking a little bit older. That's not me, man. Anyway, so the reason I picked the Vulcan Venture version is the Japanese, or at least on this release, it does not allow you to continue, whereas Vulcan Venture does allow you to continue from the last checkpoint you reached. So there's it's really hit or miss, is depending on which checkpoint you're at, you're not going to be able to make progress very easily. It's going to be a slog, and oftentimes a frustrating slog. In my practice on this title, I got to a point where I was just so frustrated I threw in the towel because I just couldn't take the constant dying. So the game is not all bad, though. There are some plus flavors. Those plus flavors being the introduction of the selectable weapons to the Gradius franchise, since the Gradius series, rather, since Salamander is just an offshoot, although that was where that was introduced. There's also the music, as always, is stellar in this game, and does help with a little bit with having to repeat sections over and over and over again. And then there's also just having, as far as the Arcade Archive release itself, having that little bit of an archive style take of two different versions. The international version, Vulcan Venture, as well as the original Gradius II arcade board. But once again, as I was saying at the beginning, this just isn't a version that I can really recommend, as there are other ways to play Gradius 2, and those ones are the ones I would recommend. So seek out the PC Engine port would probably be the one that I would most suggest, as it's a little bit easier and has some other elements, including cheat codes, to help you get through the game itself. Alright, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining me this week, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.